And welcome to Component 2, Section B, Part 3 of Mainstream and Alternative Media or Mainstream Alternative Magazines. And today we're going to focus on woman's realm and the social context of the 1960s. And just a reminder that the two magazines we're looking at for alternative and mainstream media are Huck magazine, which is our focus for alternative media, and of course Woman's Realm, which is our focus for mainstream media. And of course Huck is a contemporary magazine, modern day, and Woman's Realm is a historical magazine. And by now I hope you've had a look at the content for the magazines. You can find this in files. I've uploaded it to there, and that means you can download it and just sort of click through onto this, and you will see the content for each of the magazines, and it's not the whole magazine we've got to look at, but it's certain aspects of it, so it's worth downloading this. And if you haven't managed to download it, I have actually emailed it to you as well, so if you've got a computer you can save it on, then I would suggest you do that. And again, the Huck magazine content, again, not the whole magazine, but just selected articles, features and adverts that are in there. And the focus for today will be representation, and to start off looking at representation, we're going to consider some of the ideas of Lisbeth van Zoonen and her perspectives on gender. And a key point from van Zoonen's theory is that gender is constructed. So gender isn't a natural, innate thing that each of us have when we're born, but it's developed throughout our lives, and it's actually constructed for us. Now, the word discourse is a useful word if we can use it. Discourse really means an ideological meaning, a way of speaking to people, but it's a way of speaking to people that has sort of values attached to it. So we can sum this up maybe by looking at the idea of it being ideological. Remember, ideology, beliefs, values and ideas. Or a language of ideas about the world. So what is the world like? It influences people in terms of telling them what the world is actually like. And another key aspect of van Zoonen's point here is that meaning varies according to cultural and historical context. So really, just to emphasize this, representations within the world aren't fixed. They do not stay the same. As the world changes, because things happen in the world, historically, socially, so do representations, and they can give ideas about the world and how the world has changed. Now, to offer some context to this, if we think about the 1940s and we look at these images here, we've got women doing what we might consider to be traditionally masculine sort of roles. So women working in farms, women working in the factories with Rosie the Riveter here in her overalls and hair tied back so it doesn't get caught into the machinery and things like that, and emphasis of her physical power. Now, these were dominant representations in the 1940s, but of course, why were these dominant representations in the 1940s? What were the historical and cultural events of that time? So what was happening? It was the Second World War. So men had gone largely to fight abroad, and at the home in Britain and in America, there was a shortage of people actually to do the work in order to keep the nation going. So who's going to work in the farms? Who's going to work in the factories? And women were needed at this time. So the dominant representation became women are physically able to do this manual work and do these jobs and roles that are traditionally held by men. But just a decade later, things had changed. The dominant representation of women wasn't one where women were valued for their ability to do jobs, or it was their ability to do jobs and look after the home. And a lot of adverts, a lot of the media at the time would have a discourse to show women happy in the home and proud at what they're doing, looking after the home. So, of course, the historical and cultural context had changed. But what was going on here? Well, we've got things like men have returned to their country from wartime. We've got the baby boom, women required to look after the children at home, look after the home, and we've also got the consumer boom. So a celebration of household items, things like washing machines, for example, cookers, and things that you can buy for your house. So again, the dominant representation in the 1950s had changed drastically from the 1940s, where women were required to do different things. The 1960s was a period of significant change, and this saw the introduction of the second wave of feminism that changed the relationship between men and women. And there was a lot of things going on in the 1960s. One key thing was the introduction of the contraceptive pill. This enabled women and men to start using sex not just for reproduction, but as a leisure activity. There was a lot of political change as well. There was the civil rights movement in America, and the women's liberation movement was part of this, looking for more freedom for women, more equality for women in the workplace in regards to pay and opportunities, and some success was achieved in regards to that. There was more women going into managerial jobs that perhaps men had traditionally done before. So to some men, women began to be looked at as a bit of a threat. And of course, there was more women going to university as well, so more women getting a sort of higher education. And that's seen as a liberating force. The more education you get, the more sort of freedom you can achieve, and understand the context of your life and what you can achieve in it. So, of course, key things: the sexual revolution, linking in with the contraceptive pill, the swinging 60s. Was a time of sort of hedonism, people wanting to enjoy themselves, and you could argue this is the birth of the teenager as well. So teenagers, there'd always been teenagers before, but at this time the teenagers didn't want to just do what their parents had done, and they wanted more sort of freedom, and they wanted to experiment and try sort of different things. So we can sort of look at sort of what was happening in music and fashion at that time as well. So it was a time of great change, and particularly important for feminism. Woman's Realm magazine, however, that was in this edition published right in the middle of the 60s, 1965, didn't really reflect any of those changes, and didn't incorporate any of those political ideas. It didn't incorporate any feminism, anything that was quite sort of radical. And it presented on the front cover quite a conservative sort of looking sort of female who's covered up, not to be sort of noticed and certainly not objectified, which is quite interesting as well. So we've got to look at the context of that. And finally, the task for today, we want to reflect on that changing role of women, all those things in terms of sort of feminism, what was happening politically, what was happening socially. So going back to Van Zoonen's social and historical change, what was happening in the 1960s, it's important that we recognise this. Now, this will be knowledge that you've already got. It's transferable knowledge. We've already looked at the Time magazine from the 1950s, so we can maybe sort of use ideas from that. But also last week in the Wider Thinking for Media 2, you looked at feminism, and there was the really good and useful Netflix documentary on feminism that most of you have looked at. If you haven't, have a look at that, and you'll be able to gain some ideas on that. I'll also attach this, the changing role of women in the 1960s, which is a much shorter version of it. But if you can, make sure you've watched that Netflix one. And what I want you to do is just write a paragraph. I'll put it on a form for you so you can sort of collect it. It's easier to manage that way. I just want you to write a paragraph outlining the changing role of women in the 1960s, what was going on, what was happening, and that will help us as we move on through the course. Thank you.